The security guard didn't even look at me when he said it. "Your name is not on the list." His voice was cold, detached, like he had told 100 other uninvited guests the same thing. But I wasn't some random wedding crasher. I was the husband of the bride's sister. I was supposed to be here. I blinked, staring at him for a moment, waiting for him to check again, to realize his mistake. But he didn't. Instead, I heard laughter. Familiar laughter. My head turned, and there they were, Sabrina and her mother, standing a few yards away, watching, laughing. My own wife and her mother had their hands over their mouths, whispering to each other, grinning like they had just seen the most hilarious joke of the evening. And the joke was me. A sick feeling coiled in my stomach. I should have known. I should have known. For years, I had felt the subtle shifts in my marriage, the way Sabrina's affection had turned into something rehearsed, something distant. The way her mother's passive-aggressive remarks about me had become more direct. The way Sabrina stopped defending me. But this was something else. This wasn't passive aggression. This wasn't a few cold words behind closed doors. This was public humiliation. And I was standing there, dressed in the suit I had bought for this occasion, an expensive gift from a husband who still thought his wife wanted him by her side. A fool. My hands clenched at my sides. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on me. Guests who recognized me. A few people shifting uncomfortably, whispering. A man standing near the entrance frowned at the scene unfolding, like he wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how. Sabrina finally stopped laughing long enough to meet my eyes. And she smirked, like she had won. Like this was some game she had orchestrated, and I was the losing piece. That's when I felt it. The anger, the betrayal, the sheer humiliation boiling inside me. But I swallowed it down, forcing myself to take a breath. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to yell, to argue with the security guard, to cause a scene so she could tell everyone I was the problem. But I wouldn't give her that. I forced my expression into something neutral, something calm, something that made her smirk falter. Then, without a word, I turned and walked away. I could still hear their laughter as I stepped off the venue's perfectly manicured entrance. But what they didn't hear, what they didn't see, was the message I had sent an hour ago. The final payment cancellations. The quiet unraveling of their perfect night. They thought they had humiliated me. They had no idea what was coming. I drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of my fingers tapping against the steering wheel as I navigated the dark streets. My mind wasn't racing. No, that was the old me. The one who would have sat there dissecting everything, wondering where I went wrong, how I could fix things. That version of me died the moment I saw Sabrina and her mother laughing. Now, I was just waiting for the dominoes to start falling. Because here's the thing, I paid for everything. Every single detail of this wedding. Me. The venue, the catering, the floral arrangements, the designer dress that Sabrina's sister was probably twirling around in right now. All on my dime. Sabrina thought I was a pushover. A quiet, boring husband who tolerated every snide remark, every little act of disrespect, because I didn't fight back. But what she never realized, what she never understood, was that I don't need to fight with words. I fight with actions. And she was about to learn that the hard way. I was already in bed when my phone buzzed. 1:12 a.m. The message was short. "What did you do?" "Sabrina." I stared at the screen, my face completely blank. I didn't reply. Another message popped up. "Daniel, answer me right now." I could picture her now, standing somewhere in the wreckage of her perfect little event, mascara streaking down her face, voice shrill with panic. I placed my phone on the nightstand. Let her stew in it. Then, 3 minutes later, another message. But this one wasn't from her. "Mr. Thompson, there seems to have been a mistake regarding the final payments for tonight's wedding. We were under the impression that these costs were covered. Please contact us immediately." Oh, there it was. I smiled to myself, closing my eyes. The night was far from over for them. I woke up to the sound of furious knocking. Not the polite, hesitant kind. The kind that said someone was desperate. The kind that said someone was losing control. I didn't rush. I took my time stretching, letting the tension ease from my muscles. Then I stood, walking slowly to the door. I already knew who it was, and I wasn't disappointed. The moment I opened it, I was greeted by the sight of Sabrina and her mother. Sabrina looked like hell. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was a tangled mess. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and swollen. She had been crying. A lot. And her mother? Seething. The older woman was gripping her designer purse like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, her face twisted with rage. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Calm. Unbothered. Sabrina was the first to break. You son of a... I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Careful, I said smoothly. You're in my house. Her mother stepped forward. How dare you embarrass our family like that? Do you have any idea what you've done? I raised an eyebrow. Embarrass you? I let out a small chuckle. You mean like being turned away from a wedding I paid for? Like being laughed at in front of your friends? Sabrina flinched. That was new. For years, I had let things slide. Let them get away with it. They weren't expecting this version of me. The version that wasn't playing nice anymore. I tilted my head. Tell me, ladies, how did the wedding go? Sabrina let out a choked sound. Her mother was trembling with fury. It was a disaster. Oh, I feigned concern. What happened? Sabrina's voice cracked. Everything fell apart, Daniel. She wasn't lying. The venue had refused service, citing non-payment. The caterers had packed up their food and left before the first course was even served. The musicians never showed up. The decorators had come in the night before, set everything up beautifully, only to come back and rip it all down. The wedding had collapsed in real time. And worst of all, the guests knew. They knew exactly why. Because, just as the chaos reached its peak, the venue's manager had made a very public announcement. Unfortunately, due to non-payment, tonight's event will not be proceeding as planned. Please direct all complaints to the bride's family. The horror Sabrina must have felt. The public disgrace her mother had endured. I imagined them standing there, humiliated, as the whispers started, as the realization hit every guest. It must have been delicious. I smiled slowly. That's unfortunate. Sabrina's breathing was ragged. Why would you do this to me? Oh, there it was. Me. Not us. Not our marriage. Not, why did you leave the wedding? Or, why didn't you tell me you were upset? No. Just, why did you do this to me? I gave her a long, measured look before answering. Because, Sabrina. I leaned in just a little. My name wasn't on the list. And then, I shut the door in their faces. The pounding on the door started again almost immediately. Daniel, open this door right now. Sabrina's voice was on the edge of hysteria, shrill and raw, but I didn't move. I stood there, staring at the wood, listening. Her mother was hissing something to her in a sharp whisper, but I caught enough. Get inside. Make him listen. You fix this now, Sabrina, or you're finished. I almost laughed. Finished? She was just realizing that now? A long silence. Then a pathetic whimper. Please. I smirked to myself. Oh, now she was begging? I turned, walked back to my kitchen, and poured myself a cup of coffee. Let them stand out there. Let them sweat. They thought this was about money. They thought they could just cry, plead, manipulate their way out like always. They had no idea that the money was just the beginning. I checked my phone as I took a sip. Messages flooded my inbox. Some from the venue. Some from the vendors. Some from guests, people who had attended the train wreck last night. And then, the ones that mattered. My lawyer. My financial advisor. Everything was moving into place. They thought last night was the worst of it. They had no idea what was coming next. Another bang on the door, but this one, lighter, more controlled. I sighed. Time to end the theatrics. I opened it again, this time slower, leaning against the frame. Sabrina's mother had vanished. Of course she had. The second she realized screaming at me wasn't going to fix anything, she retreated. Probably to do what she always did, pull strings, find someone else to manipulate. But Sabrina? She was still here, alone. Her eyes were puffy, rimmed with black smudges from last night's makeup. She was shaking, but not just from anger. No, this was fear. I tilted my head. Something you need? Her lips pressed together, and for a second, I thought she'd snap again. But she didn't. She did something worse. She folded. I made a mistake. The words were so quiet, so careful, as if saying them too loudly would burn her tongue. I stayed silent. Let her talk. I shouldn't have done that to you last night. I shouldn't have let my mother. I shouldn't have laughed. It was cruel. Oh, now she understood cruelty? I waited. She swallowed hard. I don't want to lose you. A weak, fragile thing to say. And a lie. She didn't want to lose what I gave her. The money, the comfort, the life she had built off my back. And I was done carrying her. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, I asked, Sabrina, do you know how divorce proceedings work? Her face drained of color. Her mouth fell open, lips parting like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. And for the first time since I met her, she looked powerless. Good. Sabrina staggered back like I had just slapped her. Divorce? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I took another sip of my coffee, unbothered. Calm. Yes, Sabrina. Divorce. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. Her hands clenched into fists. For a moment, I saw every single thought race through her head, the calculations, the panic, the desperate search for a way to turn this around. And then, the performance began. Her lip trembled. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Classic Sabrina. Daniel, please. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I stared at her. Silent. Unmoved. You know how my mother is, she continued, voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. She pushed me into it. I didn't want to hurt you. I got caught up in the moment. Caught up in the moment? That was her excuse? I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around my mug. The sheer audacity. She had plotted to humiliate me. She had planned it, enjoyed it, laughed at it. And now? Now she wanted to pretend she was just an innocent bystander? I leaned against the doorframe, tilting my head. You got caught up in the moment? I repeated, my voice dangerously smooth. And what moment was that, exactly? The moment you removed my name from the guest list? The moment you stood there laughing as I was turned away? Or the moment you realized your life is falling apart without me? Her lips quivered. That struck a nerve. Good. She reached out suddenly, fingers grasping my wrist. Daniel, please. Let's just talk about this. We can fix it. I laughed. Actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. There's nothing to fix, Sabrina. You made your choice. Her tears finally fell. But I knew better than to fall for them now. You can't do this to me, she whispered, her voice breaking. You're my husband. I exhaled slowly. Not anymore. But I didn't say it. Instead, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. I held it between two fingers and let her stare at it for a long, heavy second before I finally spoke. This is my lawyer's contact information. She didn't take it. Her whole body locked up, like a deer caught in headlights. You're serious, she breathed. Oh my God, you're serious. I simply nodded. She ripped her hand away from me like I had burned her, shaking her head violently. No, Daniel, wait. We can talk about this. Don't throw everything away over a stupid mistake. A stupid mistake. That's what she called publicly humiliating me. That's what she called years of belittling me. That's what she called using me until she thought she didn't need me anymore. I let out a slow breath, letting her words hang in the air, letting her feel the weight of them. Then I did the only thing left to do. I gently placed the envelope into her trembling hands. Then, with a voice so calm, so final, I said, You should call soon. You're going to need it. And without another word, I closed the door in her face. The moment the door clicked shut, I stood there for a second, gripping the handle, listening. At first, there was silence. Then, a sharp gasp, a choked sob, and then the explosion. You can't do this to me. Sabrina's voice shattered the morning quiet, raw and hysterical. I gave you everything, Daniel, she screamed. I built this life with you. I closed my eyes, letting out a slow, steady breath. No, Sabrina. I built this life. I heard pacing, the frantic click of her designer heels on the concrete porch. A shaky breath. Then, a shift in her tone. Baby, please. The whiplash was almost laughable. Just seconds ago, she was screaming. No? Now she was pleading. I didn't answer. Let her panic. Let her feel what it's like to lose control. She knocked again. Softer. More desperate. Daniel. I don't want a divorce. I love you. I actually laughed at that one. A low, bitter chuckle. She didn't love me. She loved what I provided. And now? She was realizing that without me, she had nothing. I checked my phone, scrolling through my emails as she continued her one-woman meltdown on my porch. An interesting one caught my eye. From my lawyer. Subject: finalized assets and account transfers. Daniel, everything is moving as scheduled. Joint accounts have been separated, and the premarital assets are secured in your name. Sabrina will be informed of the legal standings upon official filing. Let me know if you need anything else. I smirked. Perfect. My money? Locked down. The house? Mine. Every single thing Sabrina thought she had access to was about to disappear. And she had no idea. Not yet. Outside, she was still talking. We can fix this, okay? I made a mistake. I see that now. Just open the door so we can talk. Please. I sighed, finally answering. You don't want to fix this, Sabrina. Silence. I could feel her pressing up against the door now, straining to hear me. You just don't want to lose. Another long pause. Then, a furious, guttural scream. And just like that, the real Sabrina was back. You'll regret this, you arrogant piece of... I chuckled and walked away, her voice muffling behind the thick wood of the door. No, Sabrina. The only one regretting anything was you. By noon, Sabrina was gone. I didn't bother checking to see where she went. Maybe to her mother's house. Maybe to one of her friends, the ones who had always smiled at me with barely concealed condescension. The same ones who had probably gossiped about me behind my back, whispering about how I was lucky to have married up. Up. That word had never sat right with me. Because what exactly had I married up into? A family obsessed with status. A woman who cared more about appearances than love. A life where my success was never enough. Where no matter what I accomplished, they still saw me as less. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. Not anymore. I sat at my desk, logged into my accounts, and watched as the final asset transfers completed. My name was the only one on every single document now. The house. Mine. The cars. Mine. Every account that had been joint was now securely separated. Sabrina wasn't just losing me. She was losing everything she had taken for granted. I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. And then, as if on cue, my phone rang. Her mother. I let it ring. Then it rang again. And again. The woman just didn't quit. On the fifth call, I sighed and picked up. Hello. Her voice was icy. Controlled. You listen to me, you little SH. Click. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Declined. Another call. Blocked. I sat back, smiling to myself. I could picture her now, furious, pacing, probably throwing a fit in her overpriced living room, screaming about how I was ruining her daughter's life. But the truth? Sabrina ruined her own life. I didn't need to lift a finger. She did it all on her own. By the time evening rolled around, I had almost forgotten about the chaos of the day. Almost. Until I heard a car pull into my driveway. I glanced out the window. Sabrina. Alone this time. No mother. No entourage. No fake dramatics. Just her. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the house like she was working up the courage to step out. I watched as she finally exhaled sharply, wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat, and climbed out. This wasn't the same woman who had stood on my porch that morning, screaming and demanding. No, this was Sabrina in survival mode. And I already knew what was coming. A last-ditch effort. A final play. I let her ring the doorbell 3 times before I answered. This time, she didn't push past me. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stood there, looking small. And for the first time in years, she looked afraid. "Can I come in?" I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She bit her lip, swallowed hard. Then, finally, she whispered, "Because I have nowhere else to go." I leaned against the doorframe, studying her. Her hands were shaking. Her designer bag was gone. Her expensive coat was wrinkled. And her face, her perfectly sculpted, never out-of-place face, looked pale. It had finally hit her. I folded my arms. "Where's your mother?" Sabrina let out a bitter, shaky laugh. "She told me to figure it out myself." Ah, of course she did. The same mother who had pushed her into this mess. The same mother who had encouraged her to treat me like garbage. The same mother who, the second things went south, had abandoned her own daughter. I let her words settle between us. Then I asked the question we both knew was coming. "And the guy?" She flinched. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide, panicked. "What?" I tilted my head. "The backup plan. The just-in-case guy you had lined up for when you thought you didn't need me anymore. What happened to him?" Her bottom lip trembled. And that's when I knew. He was gone too. I let the silence stretch out, let her feel every single second of it. Then, finally, I exhaled and gave her the answer she was terrified to hear. "You need to leave, Sabrina." Her face crumbled. "Daniel, please, I don't have anywhere." I cut her off. Not my problem. Her breath hitched. And for the first time since I met her, she finally understood. She had nothing. No money. No house. No mother swooping in to clean up her mess. No backup plan. And worst of all, no more me. I stepped back, grip tightening on the door. And in the same cold, final tone she had used when she watched me get thrown out of that wedding, I looked her right in the eye and said, "Your name's not on the list." Then I shut the door. And this time, she didn't knock again. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there for a moment, gripping the doorknob, listening. No crying. No screaming. No desperate banging. Just nothing. She was gone. And for the first time in years, the weight on my chest, the one I hadn't even realized had been there, lifted. I turned away from the door, walking back to my living room. The house was quiet, peaceful. No tension thick in the air. No forced small talk. No cold glances across the dinner table. Just me. I sank into my chair, exhaling slowly. It was over. Sabrina had made her choice. And I had finally made mine. 2 days passed. I expected to hear from her again. I expected another desperate attempt. A text. A call. Some half-assed attempt to gaslight me into thinking I was the bad guy. But nothing came. Not from her. Not from her mother. Not even from the so-called friends who used to act like I was invisible when we went out. It was like I had been erased from their world. Fine by me. Because the truth was, I wasn't erased. I walked away. And they hated that. I checked my email later that night, scrolling through the usual work updates, then saw one that made me pause. A message from a former acquaintance. Someone I had never expected to reach out. Sabrina's sister. The same sister who had been getting married that night. The same sister who stood there watching as I was turned away. Subject, "I need to talk to you." I stared at it for a long moment. Then, curiosity winning, I clicked. And what I read made me laugh. "Daniel, I don't know how to say this, but I had no idea what my mom and Sabrina were planning that night. If I had known, I never would have allowed it. I know you probably don't care, but my wedding was a complete disaster. Everything fell apart, and I just found out why. You paid for everything. And when you walked away, it all collapsed. I don't blame you. I need to know, did you do it on purpose? Because if you did, I don't think I've ever respected anyone more in my entire life." I leaned back, running a hand through my hair, shaking my head. "Oh, sweetheart, if only you knew." I stared at the email for a long time, my finger hovering over the keyboard. Did I owe her a response? No. Did I want to give her one? Maybe. Not because I cared about her feelings, but because I wanted to know what she was really after. Was this some half-assed attempt at an apology? Or was she just looking for confirmation, some kind of twisted admiration for how flawlessly everything had collapsed? I exhaled slowly. Then, finally, I typed 2 words. I did. And hit send. No further explanation. No justifications. No dramatics. Just the truth. Seconds later, the typing bubble popped up, then disappeared, then popped up again. I smirked. She was struggling with how to respond. Good. I closed my laptop, knowing she'd spend the next few hours overthinking everything, just like Sabrina was probably doing right now. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through. Daniel, please. I just want to talk. Sabrina. I stared at the screen, then deleted the message. There was nothing left to say. She had made her choice. Now, she had to live with it. That evening, I got another email. This one? From a lawyer. Sabrina had finally made her next move. The subject line read, Petition for temporary spousal support. I let out a low, humorless laugh. Of course, she wasn't here to apologize. She wasn't here to take responsibility. She was here for one last payday, and she thought she could get it from me. I picked up my phone, dialing my own lawyer. The second he answered, I chuckled. Well, looks like the circus isn't over yet. 2 weeks later, I sat in a conference room across from Sabrina and her lawyer. She looked different. Not physically, she was still the same woman who had spent years looking down on me, treating me like an accessory to her perfect life. No, the difference was in her eyes. There was no confidence, no arrogance, just desperation. She had tried everything to get to me. The texts, the voicemails, the fake apologies. And when none of that worked, she went straight for my wallet. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, watching as her lawyer rattled off some long-winded argument about why Sabrina was entitled to financial support. I didn't react. I barely listened, because none of it mattered. When her lawyer finally finished, my own attorney simply slid a stack of papers across the table. Sabrina signed a prenup. Silence. Sabrina froze. Her lawyer blinked. Excuse me. My attorney smiled politely. Daniel insisted on a prenuptial agreement before they were married. It clearly states that in the event of divorce, there is no spousal support. Additionally, Sabrina waived all rights to his personal and premarital assets. A slow, creeping horror spread across Sabrina's face. She didn't remember. Or, more likely, she had assumed it was just a formality. A meaningless piece of paper from a husband she never thought she'd need to worry about. Her lawyer quickly flipped through the pages, scanning the document, his expression tightening as he realized the truth. Sabrina had nothing. No claim to my money. No claim to my house. No claim to me. I watched as the reality of it crashed over her. For the first time in her life, she had to stand on her own. She clenched her jaw, fingers curling into fists. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and looked at me. And what I saw, hatred. Pure, unfiltered hatred. Good. Because the feeling was mutual. I stood up, buttoning my jacket, and grabbed my copy of the finalized documents. This is the last time we'll ever be in the same room together. She swallowed hard, her breath shaky. You'll regret this, Daniel. I gave her a long, slow look. Then, with the coldest smile I had ever worn, I said, No, Sabrina, I won't. And with that, I walked out. For good.